Good morning. Good to see everybody today, or at least to have you see me. This is the funny thing about what we're doing. I'm going to read the scripture at the end. And our passage, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but our passage begins today with Jesus leaving the house to go sit on a beach. Leaving the house to go outside. Haven't you ever been at a party or a family gathering? Maybe Thanksgiving, when you needed to get away from maybe a talkative uncle or just get some fresh air. Well, Jesus wanted or needed some space, so he went to the beach. No longer in on him. So many had to escape back to the house. But as we might expect of Jesus, he instead met the crowd in their need. He got into a boat and pushed offshore so he could speak to them. And he pointed to a farmer planting seeds and said, "You see that guy over there?" And that's often how he taught. He'd see something and point and say, "You see that woman over there? You see those sheep?" And then tell a parable. Now, to those who want answers, instead of giving definitions, Jesus gave us parables. For example, see that shepherd over there? That's what God is like. Now, it's not quite a riddle, nor is it always a satisfactory explanation. But parables give you enough wiggle room to never quite know if we've gotten it right. C.H. Dodd said parables are stories that tease our mind into thinking without us ever knowing it. And clearly, God is not a literal shepherd, so what do you mean? So, from a boat, that day, he told them a parable. There once was a farmer who just threw seeds everywhere. He didn't carefully cultivate just the right patch of earth, prepare the ground, measure out the seeds to go into perfect rows. He just threw them. Now, as the crowd listened, everyone would have laughed and thought that was ridiculous. But their curiosity would certainly have been piqued. And Jesus told them the sower threw seeds so carelessly that some fell on the road, where excited birds ate a wonderful snack. I mean, can't you just see happy pigeons gorging on cast-off bread? But that's not really such a good way to grow the wheat that makes that bread. And some of the seeds fell onto rocky ground without enough dirt to develop roots, and they began to grow. But can't you just imagine what happens to poor little sheets in the heat of the Colorado sun in July? They tried, but they were fried. And some of the seeds fell in a patch of weeds. And we all know what happens to seeds that we want to live. Surrounded by weeds, they often can't survive. And if they do, their root systems may get so intertwined that if you pull the weed out, you're likely killing the thing you're trying to grow. And in fact, Jesus maybe pointed over, and he told a parable about that, which we'll hear next week. And finally, after all of that waste, some of the seed fell on good earth, and it produced a harvest beyond the farmer's wildest dreams. That's it. He said, "If you have ears, listen." And then he got out of the boat and walked away. Now, the story leaves us with lots of questions, like why was the farmer so wasteful? Who was that farmer? And we might ask, who are we in the story? Are we called to be wasteful? Or maybe the point of the story is that at various times we are all different kinds of soil. I mean, some days things don't seem to sink in through our hard heads or rough exterior. Or maybe we are seeds, because after all, some days I feel picked on by birds pecking at me, and some days I feel fried, and some days I get tangled up in weeds. And of course, I have some good, productive days too. what are we supposed to do with this parable? But Jesus walked away for the crowd to wrestle with their own questions. Now the disciples came to Jesus later and asked him to explain what he meant. And some commentators suggest that second part never happened, that Matthew or an editor felt the need to end it with a more satisfactory explanation. But either way, nothing is said about going back to the crowd to offer them any clarity. But you know what? I believe the good news of Jesus Christ is actually found in our curiosity. The good news is found in statements like, I wonder if. More than answers and explanations, the blessing of the gospel is questions like, why? And who, me? Parables are meant to raise lots of questions and especially to question lots of assumptions. For example, questions we never thought to ask before the pandemic. We may get stuck asking questions like, when can we meet back in person again? But the pandemic offers us the opportunity to ask bigger questions like, what if and who, me? What is church to you if your church doesn't meet in person? Or what if you're attending a church right now that you've never been to or never met anyone? What does it mean to belong? Why do we do what we've always done? And once we come back, should we go back to what we've always done? The vision we call Park Hill 2.0 grew out of our pandemic experience of separation. Brian McLaren says change often only begins with pain. We quickly took everything online and some surprising things happened. Right away, we noticed that people who don't live in Denver joined us for worship. In fact, to this day, around 20% of our congregation every Sunday doesn't live in Denver. Or they live in Denver but have never set foot in our building before. And clearly, even here, our front door is no longer for people passing by on 26th and Leiden, but on the World Wide Web. Now, in addition to worship, we moved all of our existing groups online and started a new Touch Base Tuesday to ease some of our separation. And it gave us a chance to see familiar faces and share stories and laugh. It felt so good. And then one day, Jack and Ellen joined us from Connecticut. And then Tammy from Texas. And John from his cabin near Salida. It was just a nice side benefit of our separation was that we could see people who had moved away. And Chris and John and Larry and others could keep participating from their homes in the mountains. But then there were others, like Patty and Ann in South Carolina, who had no prior connections to Park Hill. They were in worship every week and then joined us for our Maundy Thursday service. Now, many years ago, I was their pastor in Cleveland, but they now lived in a very red state, and the nearest progressive church to them is 2 hours away. So they said they are grateful to have Park Hill, like a lifeline, accessible to them, whether in person or not. And accessibility is big for others too, although in a different way. Kathy and Mike live all the way down near Roxborough State Park, and Tom and Laura live all the way up in Brighton. And those are really long commutes. And they look forward to continued online access, especially when the weather turns bad this winter. Lindsay and Sean said they like this option because their toddler likes to nap at 10 a.m. Online worship any time of the day or any day of the week is a welcome convenience for some people. If you're on Facebook or Zoom, why don't you chat or tell us where you are watching from? And yet, you know what? For others, it's much more than any of this. One couple lives in eastern New Mexico. Think West Texas, she said. And they belong to a church of very nice people, but she said their church is silent about important things in our world, in our country, in our government. And she said, your church seems unafraid to meet issues head on. So during such turbulent times, your church is a safe refuge for us. Now, it's not that we'd want to take them away from their home church, but how wonderful that we can support and encourage one another in our faith wherever we may be. Just like we're supplementing the faith for Chris in Louisiana and Betty in Texas and Bernita in Iowa. And that's an important distinction. We don't want to take people away from where they may belong. But if we can partner together for a world that is open, inclusive, just, and compassionate, well, what a blessing for us all. Yet for others, we can be a place to belong, especially LGBTQ people who have few places that welcome us. Park Hill 2.0 started out as our desire not to leave anyone behind when we return to worship in person, whenever that is. We didn't fully realize, however, what it meant, what a sacred calling it is to be a lifeline or a safe refuge for progressive Christians. But let me tell you, the bottom line is this means we have to invest in good quality equipment for live streaming in the sanctuary, video, sound, and people capable of running it. Right now we're doing very well with 2 iPhones. It won't be the same when we're in the sanctuary, and it certainly won't be the same when some people are in person. But church is much more than coming to worship on Sundays, whether you're in person or online. So we don't want people watching or observing. We want them to fully participate in faith development and community life. And so Park Hill 2.0 envisions ongoing gatherings and studies online, each of us now in our own homes, but eventually capable of including groups that meet in church and at the same time people living anywhere. And this further benefits people who don't wish to go out for health or mobility reasons, or frankly, driving across Denver in rush hour is so aggravating, it limits participation in weekday activities. So for now, both Inez, 10 blocks away, and Sally in Steamboat Springs can keep participating in our book study of how to be an anti-racist. And in the future, some of those folks will be gathered here in their church too, or for leadership meetings, or Sunday school. But here's the bottom line on this. It means investing in video conferencing equipment. What comes next? So we have developed a strategy for Park Hill 2.0 that envisions a path for someone who is curious and may observe us online to become a participant in some group or gathering, like Susan and Carol have, who've never been here, but have now become regulars in groups. They are participants who have moved from being observers. And next is to become a supporter of ministry through prayer or giving, and then to become a fully committed partner in ministry, and perhaps even serving in leadership. It's a path from curious to committed, and it's the same for someone who worships with us in person, but you know what? We never really articulated it before. We just sort of more assumed that's how things work. But the pandemic has taught us to put more time and attention into each stage and offer meaningful experiences that help each of us grow in our faith and for our faith community to grow. And as we began last fall, to nurture growing relationships, as we learned in our relational campaign. We have greatly increased our social media ministry to invite people to observe. The church now has 1,000 followers. Our blogs, one of my posts, 3,000 views. But what's the next step? And so to invite greater participation, I'm excited to announce some new programming we've been developing for exactly that purpose. So we have these ongoing groups, but in 2 weeks we're going to add another weekly evening option, a course called Gratitude During Difficult Times. It'll go for 6 weeks on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Mountain. And I'm going to co-lead it with Lori Fell, who lives in Pittsburgh, for whom it will be 8 p.m. And in the fall, Terry is planning to begin an evening group called P Squared, People in Prayer. And again, we're going to do it at 6 so that people across all the time zones can reasonably participate. And one of the things we have to think about now going forward. The possibilities are endless. You know what? In fact, they may be a little overwhelming. On Thursday, people at our luncheon lectionary, which has more than doubled during the pandemic, we talked about one of the things our country needs is healing our urban-rural divide. And that why couldn't we partner with a church out there somewhere for a dialogue on Zoom? Which prompted me to think, I'm going to reach out to, and I did, I reached out to a pastor friend at a black UCC in Virginia, and we're talking about a joint group Bible study. We could invite authors like we did last year with John Pavlovitz over Zoom, which would save both cost and carbon. And in fact, there are so many things possible that we may have to remember to be strategic and return to our mission, that we not do everything, but ask, how does this help us build a world that is open, inclusive, just, and compassionate? Although, on the other hand, so Jesus told this parable about throwing seed wherever it may fall. And surely we don't want to limit God's grace from leading us places we wouldn't have expected. I'm not sure Jesus wants us to be wasteful, but perhaps it's that we shouldn't be so cautious that we don't try new things, which would be a terrible waste of the opportunity this pandemic has handed to us. In many ways, the vision of Park Hill 2.0 isn't that exceptional or even groundbreaking. It just embraces methods that increase our reach and widens our welcome. Sadly, however, it seems to be exceptional in that others either aren't or haven't yet embraced or articulated a vision like this. And that's why one of our online worshipers, who's never been in our church building, who comes to us from Arizona, has donated $10,000 for our efforts. She heard me talk about our vision for Park Hill 2.0 during worship on Pentecost and said, I want to invest in that. She was excited and frustrated that her own church doesn't have this kind of vision. Now, she said she doesn't want her own pastor to know about her gift, but she does want you to know and invites you to join her and make that kind of investment in Park Hill 2.0 as well. There's so much more I could say, but you know what? Like Jesus, I'm going to stop there, step away, and leave you with more questions than answers. And then at 11:30, we can discuss what this means to you. We're going to do breakout rooms on Zoom. And while there is so much that remains unknown in our world right now, these things seem certain. We value relationships. We value growing in our faith. We value worship, and we seek a world that is open, inclusive, just, and compassionate. And if you value that too, be more than curious. Commit to joining us. And now I want to read that parable. At about the same time, Jesus left the house and sat on the beach. And in no time at all, a crowd gathered along the shoreline, forcing him to get into a boat. And using the boat as a pulpit, he addressed the congregation, telling stories. What do you make of this, he said. A farmer planted seed, and as he scattered the seed, some of it fell on the road, and birds ate it, and some fell in the gravel, and it sprouted quickly, but did not put down roots. So when the sun came up, it just withered. Some fell in the weeds, and as it came up, it was strangled by those weeds. And some fell on good earth. and produced a harvest beyond his wildest dreams. Are you listening to this? Really listening? And he stepped away. But part 2, whether or not it actually happened, here it is in Matthew. Study this story of the farmer planting seed. When anyone hears news of the kingdom and doesn't take it in, it just remains on the surface. And so the evil one comes along and plucks it right out of that person's heart. This is the seed the farmer scatters on the road. The seed cast in the gravel, this is the person who hears and instantly responds with enthusiasm. But there is no soil of character. And so when the emotions wear off and some difficulty arrives, there is nothing to show for it. The seed cast in the weeds is the person who hears the kingdom news, but weeds of worry and illusions about getting more and wanting more, everything under the sun, strangle what was heard, and nothing comes of it. The seed cast on good earth is the person who hears and takes in the news and then produces a harvest beyond his wildest dreams. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.